There are some interactions between two species which are good for species 1 and bad for species 2, and it's usually because species 1 is eating species 2. Keep in mind that these interactions don't need to be kind of the classic predator-prey interaction like the one that's shown here. There are lots of other types of interactions where one individual is eating the other. So for example, parasites, like this bed bug, it's eating only a little bit of you, but it still can have a negative effect on you, and of course, feeding on your blood has a positive effect on the bed bug. Similarly, when an animal eats a plant, that's negative for the plant and positive for the animal. Even animals that feed on seeds are kind of like predators in that they're killing the seed. That was actually a living organism before this weevil got to it. Feeding on that seed has a positive effect on the weevil, on the seed, a very negative effect. And parasites and pathogens that live within our bodies are also eating little bits of us that harms us and helps the pathogen. All of these interactions, whether they're predation, parasitism, herbivory, disease, these can all be kind of gathered together under the heading of exploitation. Exploitation is basically when one organism is eating a different organism. All living organisms have evolved defenses against getting nibbled on. Some of the defenses are really obvious. So you could have an organism with armor like a turtle, or you could have an organism with really strong, sharp thorns like this rose bush. Some defenses are much more subtle. So for example, your immune system is wonderfully complicated, and it guards you from being parasitized, essentially, by microscopic organisms. Plants also have developed a lot of defenses. They are masters of chemical defense. Most of the spices that give flavor to your food exist because in higher quantities, they're able to damage or kill animals that try to eat that plant. Usually we're talking about insects that are trying to feed on a plant. Sometimes the defenses that organisms have involve behavior rather than anything physical or chemical. So for example, when there are wolves in an area, elk abandon the places that they like to hang out, which are river valleys or streams, and they'll hang out at the tops of hills where they can see clearly and run away as soon as wolves appear on the horizon. There are even more bizarre defenses than this. For example, there are some caterpillars that when they're threatened by birds, they inflate their heads so they look like some kind of snake. One thing that I want you to be aware of is that all of them are costly. All of these defenses, whether they're physical or chemical or behavioral, having them is hard on the organism in some way. So, for example, making thorns costs energy and material that this rosebush could otherwise be using to make seeds. The same is true for the chemicals that these plants make. As for behavior, these elk would much rather be hanging out near the streams because that's where their food is. It turns out that when they go up on the hilltops, even though they're a lot safer from wolves up there, they frequently starve to death. And this is a general pattern when it comes to defenses against being eaten. Not getting eaten can get you killed. It's costly in terms of your ability to survive and reproduce. Nature specials don't often focus on this because blood and guts tend to be more exciting, but there are a lot of interactions between species that are actually good for both species. Both species benefit from the interaction. As a rule of thumb, different large classes of organisms have different strengths. So for example, plants can perform photosynthesis. This means that if they've got sunlight and water and air, they can make sugar. I mean, sugar is basically free as far as a plant is concerned. Fungi send out these very thin thread-like parts of their body through the soil or through rotting wood or through decaying flesh, and they collect nutrients. They are experts at collecting nutrients. a lot of bacteria can change chemical compounds from one form to another. Often, if there's a chemical transformation that only one organism on Earth can do, that one organism is a microbe. Frequently, these win-win interactions are based on organisms trading their strength. It's like an economy based on barter. I'm really good at making sugar. You are really good at taking nitrogen and making it into fertilizer. Let's make a trade. And this is, in fact, what happens in some of the most successful mutualisms on Earth. These are the mutualisms between nitrogen-fixing plants and the bacteria that live in their roots. There are some bacteria that can take the nitrogen gas that's in the air and make it into essentially fertilizer for plants. And there are some plants that make little homes for these bacteria in their roots. They give sugar and shelter to the bacteria in return for the nitrogen that they get and use to grow. Similarly, there's a mutualism between plants, which find it very difficult to move around, and animals, which can't make their own sugar. Plants offer the animals nectar, which contains a lot of calories, and the animals in return will visit those plants. They get pollen all over their bodies, and then they take that pollen to another flower and accidentally pollinate that other flower. This means that the plant gets pollinated and the animal gets more food. It's a win-win. Mutualisms are probably more important than you think. So for example, this mutualism here is worth about $19 billion each year in the US alone. If these bees weren't around to pollinate plants, we would have to do it by hand, and that would be tremendously expensive. The other mutualism that's even much more important to you, although you may not even know about it, is the relationship you have with what's called your microbiome. Inside your body, there are a vast number of bacteria. And those bacteria do a lot of really helpful things for you. They help to digest your food, which has been recognized for a long time, but it turns out they also do a lot of other things. They're very important in regulating your body weight. They're important in preventing you from having overreactions in your immune system, that is allergies. And they can even affect your mental health. Researchers are finding that all these bacteria living in your body are critical for you being healthy and happy. The most dramatic mutualism in your life is actually one that's so old and so complete that it's hard to say whether the two organisms involved are actually different species or not. Within each of your cells, there are these little organelles called mitochondria. These are organelles that can use oxygen to generate power. Essentially, they generate energy that your cells can use. They once were free-living bacteria. Billions of years ago, what happened was that there was a free-living cell. This was a single-celled organism, nothing like any of the, or nothing like you are today, that was not able to make a lot of energy on its own. And there's this free-living bacterium that was able to use oxygen to generate a lot of energy. This blue cell here offered essentially a home to this bacterium. At any rate, this bacterium ended up living inside this larger cell. The cell got energy from the little bacterium. It was able to provide the bacterium with shelter and maybe some kind of food. And so the two became a team. In fact, they became such a closely linked team that eventually a lot of the genes from this bacteria, a lot of the instruction set that this bacteria needs in order to reproduce, got transferred into the nucleus of this cell. So that now it's impossible for this what used to be a bacterium to live independently of its host. This partnership proved to be so successful that this new cell went on to give rise to most of the organisms that we think of as life. All of the animals, all of the plants, all of the fungi that you see today are descended from this long ago ancestor that first adopted mitochondria.